Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Ask Me Anything, sponsored by the School of Information and Library Science, which is affectionately known as SILS, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My name is Brian Sturm, and I am the Associate Dean for Academics here, and I'm also a professor on the faculty. And I will be your host and MC for this particular edition of Ask Me Anything. Just one sort of housekeeping thing at the beginning. If you have questions that you would like to ask any of our participants, you use the question and answer, the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and put the questions in there, and I will try and work them into our interview sessions. We have 4 people on our docket for today: Dr. Stephanie Haas and Dr. Shayamandu Dasgupta, Dr. Maggie Milo, and Matt Peralt. We'll be interviewing them and allowing them to answer the questions that you have already posed. We have some that have been posed early that we will be bringing up, and we have others, hopefully, here that will come in throughout the course of these interviews. So our first interview is with Stephanie Haas. Hello, Stephanie. How are you today?
I am just brimming with joy today, by which you can tell that I've had technical difficulties over the last hour, but this is much more fun.
Good. Well, we'll hope for no technical difficulties this time. I have a series of questions that people have sent in and submitted that I would like you to have a chance to answer and talk about. The first one is that you were an early adopter of online education, and you've done sort of video recordings for your lectures, but what other design elements have you included in developing these online courses to ensure that your students stay engaged?
Well, I'm assuming that they are engaged since I have no contact with them, because they successfully managed to do the assignments and participate in the various activities for the course. One of my concerns as I was designing this is, how do you replicate Stephanie giving you an assignment in the classroom and walking around and peering over your shoulder and giving useful hints? So I chopped things up into small little bits for any unit that include, all right, here's an exercise based on a slide you just watched. Pause the video, do the exercise, restart the video, and I will walk you through what the solution is. So I have a lot of that so that it's not just me, I'm a student here, sitting back and sort of letting my eyes glaze, that there is some interaction built in there. Another part that I think, as you well know, was the fun part, was doing the actual seeing my face, giving an introduction to each unit. And folks, what you might not know is that I had an expert coach and cameraman to help me through those, so that I didn't look like I was reading something, or I didn't sound like a zombie, which is, you know, interesting but not very engaging. So Brian worked with me on those, and you kind of encouraged me, as we know, to do some kind of dramatic things towards the end of it, as we both got more comfortable with that. So if you're in my database class this semester, be prepared for the dark side. I will say more.
I do have very fond memories.
I broke out laughing, and just, I think we had to redo it a couple of times because we couldn't keep a straight face on that one.
Yeah, we had multiple takes on some of those because we couldn't maintain a straight face. I do remember that. So this sort of chunking has, I want to follow up on that a bit. The idea of taking sort of smaller bits for your interactions and interspacing, interweaving. Do you feel, or did you find that the shorter segments were actually more engaging, or was it the shift from lecture to interaction that was what really captured students, you feel?
I don't have a good answer for that. I tried to keep the pre-recorded videos where I was narrating slides. I had all of the movement and things popping in and out on the slides, and went along, kept pace with them with my narrative, just so that it's not just a static slide. So I think that was one thing. But it's so easy in an online course, and I think we all know that a little more, to just start glazing over. And so making things in shorter pieces so you can stop easily and walk away rather than just walking away, I think is one piece. And the other thing is we're condensing what might take a couple of hours spread over a couple of days for a face-to-face course. And it really is very condensed. If you watch it just straight through, you could get through an incredible amount of material, but there's no break there. So I kind of tried to force the breaks by saying, okay, now here's a new thing that you're going to work on, and you have to scroll down and you have to start the next video. It was also easier for me to plan for very short videos. I think they're mostly under 5 minutes even, just to break it up a little bit for me as I was creating them and recording them.
Thank you. The another question was dealing with your collaborations, either across campus or even off campus. And the question came in, how did you develop those collaborations? And then a follow-up kind of question to that is, do you have any suggestions for students in terms of how they can build their either research or social network, that way, professional network?
Well, as far as building professional networks, I have Lori Haight into my 202 class every semester as one of the first guest speakers, because her idea of how you form that information environment and web of connections is very proactive, far more than anything I've ever done. So she is an excellent role model for that. One of the things, I've collaborated with folks in the over on the medical side of campus a great deal. And I think one of the pieces of advice I have is always go to that first meeting when you say, find somebody and you start kind of casually talking and say, well, let's get together and talk about it. Or somebody approaches you. That first meeting and conversation, just always go to that. You may decide that you can't stand any of these people, or this is not the direction you want your work to be going. But you never know when something else is going to come up. And so that first step may be the first step on a good path of collaboration. I've had collaborations that have lasted for many, many years. Or it may be, well, yeah, but this isn't really where I want to go. So I think that first yes is important. And then once you know a little bit more, go on from there. I think, and you can be the one who makes the invitation as well. I think the other piece I would say is, just like any other collaboration or research collaboration, is going to have its ups and downs. And the more clearly you can each articulate what you're bringing and what your responsibilities are, the better. Don't assume that everybody thinks the same way you do.
Yeah, good points. Are there ways to actually establish those first meetings? Because you said, say yes to the first meeting and then figure out whether it's something that fits you. Is there a way for students to feel empowered to actually reach out and request that first meeting or establish that somehow?
That's hard. It's not something I'm always happy to do either. If you can make up a reason, so did you read something about them and we're just wondering if, did you read something they wrote? Did you see a project that they did? If there's any kind of thread you can pull out that will say, there's a reason why I'm first saying hi, and now I'm also offering this. Sometimes people are going to say no or just ignore it. That's all right. It hurts, but you know, sometimes people say no. So if you can come up with not just a, I want to work with you. It's the, I want to work with you on such and such, or at least I'd like to talk to you about it, and maybe something will come of it. I think the other thing is, when you're in an established organization, it may not be this year, it may be 3 years from now that something comes up that works out. From the student perspective, what can you offer? I saw you do this, or I read this, and here's what something I did that is somewhat related, so that you can help build that initial bridge.
I think that's good advice for their proposal development class as well, when they're trying to figure out who my faculty advisor is going to be. Makes sense that they would follow that similar process. Stephanie, your interest in natural language processing, that's been sort of a core area for you for your career here. How did that develop as an interest, and has it changed over the course of your time at SILS?
I like words.
She says very succinctly.
Yes, I won't use many words, but I like them. First of all, my father was an English professor, and he liked words as well. So it comes naturally. Mm-hmm. When I first started in information science, the idea of natural language processing was about as clunky as you could be. And one of the first projects I worked on in graduate school was, hey, maybe we can do search, information retrieval search, not just by a single word, but by started looking phrases, or even words that are within some number of words of each other, which may suggest more than just a single keyword. Because if you can do that, then you're not dependent on keywords and index terms that somebody else has been working on. You can actually look at the material itself, at the article. And as I say this, it lets me know how long I've been in this business, because that isn't even a question anymore. That's not a problem. And they've got the problems of words. And so that's what has changed is it's not quite so clunky, and you can actually get some reasonable results. Now, language has changed along the way as well. It's getting information out of beautifully written and edited text is not wildly challenging. It's challenging, and people use words in interesting ways, but being able to work with short texts, being able to work with mixed media that include text, being able to work with code switching when you have a single text and either the language is changing or the register is changing, and being able to recognize where those shifts are, because you may need different techniques. The fundamental questions haven't changed, but our use of language and the availability of language for any kind of analysis is far beyond what it was. I remember a long time ago, and by a long time ago, I probably mean about 20, maybe 30 years, I wrote a book review on someone who was working on a system that would take a pattern of story, a typical fairy tale, for example, and by using word substitutions of various kinds, transform it into a different story. Same structure, but a different story. The characters would change, the setting would change, you can substitute broader terms or narrower terms, and so on. It was pretty clunky, but now we can generate stories, we can generate text of various kinds, but it's still a little clunky once you get out beyond the predictable. One of the units I sometimes have in my applications of NLP class is on creative text, especially on writing poetry. Well, now poetry is an interesting form because it doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't necessarily have to have a plot. It can evoke a picture, but we're very good at evoking pictures from random words. We can make sense out of just about anything, any collection of words, if that's what we're trying to do. So that automatically generated poetry that's based on some seed or other can be surprisingly successful because it's read by a person who is trying to make it make sense. So that what does the system have to do to enable what the person can do? So this idea of creative writing still depends a little bit on the scaffolding, I guess, of either poetry can be anything or this is a standard story structure. But if you think about it, if you are reading or hearing standard sports stories, large amounts of those, except for the particular anecdotes, aren't written by people. Mm-hmm. They are automatically generated because really, how many ways can you report a baseball score? So,
as a professional storyteller as well, I share your love of words. We have about a minute left, so I'm going to ask you a very quick question, and that is, can you tell us what your favorite class is to teach at SILS?
No.
Well, that's a quick answer.
I can't do that because they each are so enjoyable. What I think the theme is that you have to look at the world in a different way. If you're teaching, if you're going to do database, then the world is a database. How do you reduce everything to data points that you can query? The applications of natural language processing, well, it's language, and what we can do with computers and language and people is just so astonishingly wonderful and astonishingly scary when you think about spreading misinformation, disinformation, threats, and so on. So that one sort of, well, language covers the universe, so that course can too as well.
Thank you very much.
So no, I can't tell you what's favorite.
Okay, it's kind of like asking a librarian what's your favorite book. All right, well, thank you for joining us, and it's been delightful chatting with you this afternoon, and we will move on to our next interview. Thanks again, Stephanie.
Thanks.
Welcome, Shaimindu.
Greetings. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, great to have you here. We've also had some questions submitted in advance for you, and the first one I'd like to start with is the sort of your interest in children and algorithmic data systems and your work on Scratch and other kinds of systems. Can you tell us sort of what got you interested in that particular area and how you see that as that whole area has evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that my answer would be in two parts, essentially. Like, one drawing from my own personal experiences as someone who was growing up around the time when a lot of these algorithmic systems and data-driven systems were also sort of becoming more and more prevalent in our lives. And also the general educational experience that I personally had, I felt that the systems that I was seeing around me allowed me to express myself creatively in very different types of ways. And that was something that I sort of figured out by myself in a certain way, and I want to make sure that like these experiences can be experienced by as many people as possible, because it was for me a transformative experience, like being able to express myself through these sorts of digital media. At the same time, I also recognized that as these systems became much more prevalent, the need for questioning these systems and critiquing these systems became more and more important because, like, they control various aspects of our lives, and sometimes we do not know about them. Sometimes we do know about them, but we can't really do anything. And I think, like, for me, for example, just a simple example, which sort of like was again one of my formative experiences growing up, was I speak Bengali as my own mother tongue. I'm not a native English speaker, but when I was growing up, I soon realized that in order to use digital technology in any form, I needed to know another language. In order to write computer programs, I need to know English. And that is something that's not talked about a lot. Now, things have changed over time. Like, now there are possibilities where you can, like, use digital technologies in a language that is not in English, but that took a while. And more recently, like, we are seeing, like, technologies which such as, like, face recognition, which are being used pervasively, but do not work very well for everyone out there. So those questions led me to what is, I guess, my current research agenda in terms of, like, how do we allow young people and support young people and their educators as well in not just knowing about the technical know-how about, like, how to write computer programs or how to, like, do data analysis, but also question them and critique their implications. And so I guess, like, what has been really inspiring to me has been seeing how creative young people can be in terms of how they have been using the technologies that have played a part in developing, and how expressive they have been, and taking the technologies and the possibilities to, like, things that I myself as a designer had not imagined. And I think, like, that is sort of something that keeps me going on.
Can you give us an example of something that has sort of totally surprised you that way?
Yeah, sure. So I think, so, like, taking the example of Scratch, Scratch is a programming language for young people. I was a part of the team that developed Scratch when I was in graduate school, and it has a community around it, which has, like, young people from all over the world, and something that, I mean, on hindsight, like, it was like, oh yeah, like, that's obvious, but like, something that really was an evocative experience from me was suddenly, like, one day, like, while going over the Scratch website, like, looking at projects that kids were sharing on the Scratch website, I saw a project which combined the traditional art form of where I'm from, Kolkata, West Bengal, India, and combined the art form from that region of the world into Scratch programs. And in a sense that, like, that doesn't, like, surprise me when I'm, like, sort of, like, thinking about it now, because, like, yeah, sure, like, it's a global online community, but at that point, like, there was this sort of, like, very evocative moment for me, because I was like, like, oh yeah, like, two of my worlds are coming together. And those sorts of surprises keep on happening. Like, in the workshops that I run, like, like, I have questions that, like, are completely unexpected, that are being asked of me, like, projects and possibilities that are being imagined, that are, like, completely surprise me. And those are really inspirational.
Yeah. I mean, you read so much about children and youth and technology now, and sometimes it's the negative impact on it, and sometimes on children, and sometimes it's the, oh, what an amazing opportunity. COVID has showed us just how important technology is in terms of continuing the things that we're used to doing in an altered format. So I'm always impressed with the research that you do. Could you talk a little bit about your NSF grant?
Sure, absolutely. So the NSF grant that I currently have supports a project which is around developing new tools that would support young people in developing data literacies. And the research question, so what we are developing is, the core thing that we are developing is a block-based visual programming language, which looks like Scratch, but allows someone to do data analysis using data from various types of sources. So, for example, like you can use that data set to analyze data released by the town of Chapel Hill to see what are the sort of hotspots in the Chapel, which are the neighborhoods in Chapel Hill where air quality can be a concern. And so the idea is to enable young people to create their own data analysis tools rather than just consuming data, like the results of data analysis. And what we are trying to find out in terms of research questions are what are the design principles that work, and also how are young people thinking about data when they are trying to answer a question with data themselves. What are the mental models that they have? Where are they getting stuck? How can we help them get unstuck? What sort of material would help these young people and their educators, and what sort of experience would help these young people and their educators support the fostering of data literacies?
Fascinating. Have you seen a change in the technology world from the sense of using tools or using technologies to creating technologies?
Absolutely. I think there's a general shift in that direction. Yeah, I was looking at recently a lot of smart home devices, and there are communities growing around these devices where people are not only figuring out how to use these systems, but how to also, for example, figure out ways in which these systems can talk to each other. So, for example, someone shows up at your door and, the music level goes down and things like that. So, small sort of one of the design principles that I really like in terms of designing construction kits where you are allowed to create something is that a little bit of programming goes a long way. And I think this sort of little small piece of logic that you implement in terms of connecting these two of your devices together can lead to someone feel really empowered in terms of here are two devices that I managed to connect together and define the behavior of, and I'm not just a passive user. I am using these devices in a way that's more creative.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you a similar question of whether you can tell me your favorite class.
What's that Stephanie said? I don't think I have a favorite class, but I think each class provides me with unique perspectives on how students are thinking, and I really enjoy that aspect. and figuring out, like, I teach two programming classes. Like, I'm teaching two programming classes currently. One is project based, very much based on what the students are interested in. The other one is the more traditional, like, there are a set of assignments, and it is fascinating for me to see, like, how students approach these two different types of classes, because the content, there are overlaps in the content area, like in terms of what I'm teaching. The other thing that I really enjoy is just figuring out metaphors. Like, when I'm teaching programming, I use a lot of metaphors. Like, data structures are like a kind of, like, list data structure is like, like a can of Pringles and like things like that. And each sort of like it's not that like a metaphor will work for every student, but what really excites me is this idea of like trying to identify what sort of metaphors work for which students.
Mhm.
And then like recognizing that sort of aha moment that students have when a metaphor works or when a certain way of explanation works. And that really excites me.
Yeah. How do you find, one of the things that struck me, because as a storyteller, I also play a lot with figurative language in storytelling. But it struck me that your interest in language and metaphor there, is it somewhat at odds with the technologies that we have? Because you're using metaphor as a way to teach, but can the technologies handle metaphors? Can computers process metaphors yet?
I guess in some constrained ways, yes.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's a challenge. Like, just as metaphors do not always work well in the real world, and you have to be cautious about it. And like when I'm like when I used to teach INLS 201, I think which is the sort of Foundations of Information Science course for undergrads who are interested in our program, we would talk a lot about computational models. And I think a similar caveat applied there as well. Like, they're useful, but they are an idealized way of the world. They do not represent everything completely. And so that is something that we need to be aware of whenever we are talking about models or metaphors, things like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The whole idea of a metaphor as a creative synergy between two planes of reference is something that I've really struggled with to try and find a way to get into my thinking about technologies as well. And part of me is hopeful that we never get to that point, because that's one of the things that that I think is so human, that we can make these really fascinating and beautiful creative leaps between ideas. Yeah. I kind of want to hold on to that and keep that for us. Well, thank you so much, Simon. It's been an absolute delight chatting with you, and I look forward to seeing you around the halls here of Manning Hall. We'll move on to our next interviewee here. Welcome, Maggie. It's good to see you.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's great to be here too.
Absolutely. And I have a series of questions that have been submitted. So we'll work our way through those. And if any new ones come up, remember, those of you who are watching, if you would like to submit a question, you can put it in the question and answer in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screens of the interface here. So Maggie, you joined us a couple of years ago, and your interest has been in sort of inclusive makerspaces. Can you tell us why or how you became interested in this kind of makerspace world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in 2014, as a PhD student at the University of Arizona, the Science and Engineering Library folks wanted to create their very first makerspace. And so in doing so, they wanted to make sure that they had multiple perspectives at the table. So 3 perspectives. They wanted someone from, of course, the libraries represented. They wanted someone from the entrepreneurship program. And they also wanted to tap someone from the digital humanities program as well. And so I was tapped from the digital humanities side. Dr. Kim McAllister, a beloved advisor who's been an exceptional mentor and also colleague, asked me if I'd be interested in starting this makerspace. Now, I didn't know what a makerspace was, but I knew that it aligned with my own pedagogical values, right? I value collaboration, experiential learning, holistic learning, and also the ability to take creative risks with different technologies. And so I said I was on board. And so over time, working in the science and engineering library in the makerspace for several years, my interest began to peak when some very interesting interactions emerged, right? So I'm arriving to this space as an English major, as a rhetorician. And so what really fascinates me has to do with the language within a makerspace. And so questions around who's in the space came up a lot. Most notably, as a woman of color and also first generation student, many times people would ask me things like, did you really print that? Or, oh, are you lost? Can you point me to someone who could help me with a virtual reality HTC Vive? And so for me at first, it was just like, whoa, that kind of hurts. But as a researcher, right, it's like, these are some really interesting questions that are coming up around language and also about the space. What is it about a makerspace that compels people to think in a certain way? What are the values of that space? And so that interest really kind of kept me going as a researcher. It was really a space for like the energy and life source around the questions I have today as an assistant professor. Now, from a personal standpoint, I will say it feels really powerful, even transformative, to make something, to repair something. And we're seeing that kind of bubble up now with like movements like the right to repair, right? There's legislation that is pressuring companies to allow consumers to repair their electronics, to alter or modify the different technologies they have at home. And so that is also what makes me feel so good. I learned how to sew a few years ago, and oh my goodness, the time it takes to make a shirt, right? But also the feeling of like, I have a rip in my skirt, I could repair that, versus having that knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, well, I got to buy something new, right? So it allows me to move from this passive consumer participant to really think about my role differently. And so I love how this also translates into learning in a makerspace. One really quick anecdote, the button maker. I love the button maker. So recently, as a SILS community, we convened on Tuesday to kind of take a collective pause and be together. And so my contribution to the group was bringing the button maker. And so folks are just looking at this thing like, how do we use this thing? How does it create this, this mundane object, this button? And so my favorite part is when students, well, actually anyone who was there, had an idea, created the thing, and then voila, they have it in their hand. And I think it's that moment where things get super powerful in the sense that, number one, they realized how easy it was. And number two, it's also kind of like, wow, there's something that I feel great about that I was able to make this mundane thing into something in my head. So in terms of my interest in makerspaces, it happened gradually, but there's many different things that really kept me in research-wise, personally, and also pedagogically.
So it strikes me, this makes me think of what Shaiminda was saying about the switch from using information to creating information. Do you have any sort of your own personal beliefs about why now? What is it about makerspaces that has seemingly been sort of exploding into the national scene, certainly in libraries and other cultural institutions? What's going on there behind the scenes that is pushing us to want to create? Is it the internet and our ability to create information there, and it's sort of bled over into the physicality of makerspaces, or is something else going on?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. So I will say the maker movement kind of arrived in the scene at a really interesting time in the mid 2000s. It was at this moment where different forces were converging. Social media was really booming. And when I mean social media, I'm talking about specifically YouTube tutorials, Pinterest, Instructables. So social media where people are allowed to share their project ideas, but also get help, right? Why isn't my code compiling? Why isn't it uploading in my Arduino? These, by the way, are questions I've had the past several weeks lately. But as social media was kind of bubbling up, so too were kind of like consumer grade technologies, 3D printers, which is like the signifier of the maker movement, and I say that sarcastically, also became readily available and affordable. So together it created this phenomenon where people were actually creating things in their own homes. And that's an interesting concept that Alvin Toffler talked about with the third wave and talking about prosumerism, producing and consuming, this idea that homes will become their own like electronic cottages where people will be creating more customized objects for their day-to-day lives. And so I think about that in the broader scale of things, but why in this moment are libraries specifically integrating these maker spaces, right? And so what we're continuing to see is that libraries have continued to be spaces where we ask things like, where can I find this book, this article? Where can I consume this information? But also we're seeing that libraries, especially academic libraries, are spaces that it's become not only where can I, but also how can I, right? How can I visualize the journey maps of underrepresented students in a makerspace through 3D printing? Or how can I, conceptualize empathy from someone who's experiencing a microaggression through virtual reality, right? In terms of seeing tunnel vision or having that kind of capacitive touch in virtual reality. And so there's this lot of movement that really collapsed that binary between producing and consuming. And we're seeing that come up through making and different, maker culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's the sort of a societal movement toward this. What do you see as the particular benefits of makerspaces for students and for alumni of our school?
Yeah, so that is a good question. Can you repeat that again, Brian?
Yeah, I'm curious because you said that there's this sort of there's this social movement toward creating and making and whatnot, and that it has benefits for us. But I'm intrigued about the very particular benefits you see of makerspaces for students and alumni. Are there benefits not to the broad population, but for that specific population on campus?
Yeah, I'm thinking in a very local sense about the new makerspace that we have in Manning Hall.
Yeah.
So the makerspace is housed in the Data and Society Innovation Collaboratory, and it's in Manning Hall. It's in the basement. The garden level, and that is also where the Equity and Making Lab is housed. And so this is a lab that I'm the director for. I'm also the PI of an NSF career grant that is supporting this space as well. And so when thinking about the benefits of this space, I really have to think critically about the community it tends to serve. So right off the bat, I want to give credit to the exceptional team that I get to work with. I get to work with Laura March, Mimi Stockton, Rachel Rodney, Emily Arnsberg, and I've worked with Dr. Kimberly Hirsch as well. These folks collectively have created the vision for the space. The paint, the mural, the plants in the space, the free little library. The idea behind it was that in order to create a space that appeals to a community, it needs to be created by and for it as well. And so I give them utmost credit for the labor and the visioning they had for it. Because as the research will show, and as I'm doing research as well on this, maker spaces are pretty cookie cutter. And when they are cookie cutter, that's when we run into the issues of, well, we're not attracting people, or we're attracting a very narrow demographic of users. So when thinking about the benefit, it always goes hand to hand with how it is in service to the community. And so far, it's been going pretty well. I will say I was in this space, well, I'm in this space usually weekly, but I had a student walk in and the student looks around and they were like, this feels nice in here, but I'm not sure, is this a makerspace? And I'm like, see, that's exactly, it's makerspace has the technologies, but another major component, which the team was so great at capturing, had to do with the affectiveness of it, the good vibes, as they would say. So yeah, it really is community oriented when it comes down to it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of community, the community of information and library science faculty here is very diverse in terms of our backgrounds. And you come to SILS with a background from English. So I'm curious, what do you see as the affordances or the benefits of not having necessarily a library and information science degree, but what are the strengths of bringing your background in English?
That's a funny question. And I will preface my response by saying that sometimes some students in hushed tones will come up to me and say, hey, I heard you're an English major. I am too. And look at us over here at SILS. And I'm all like, wait, what? It's a funny question. And I'll get to my response. But I will say this. I am investigating why STEM-rich learning environments like makerspaces attract a narrow demographic of users. This is a big question. It's a complicated question. And in thinking in that way, it really isn't siloed to a specific discipline, whether that's English or information science. I think coming in with a different discipline, although there's much overlap, it allows me to tap into different networks of folks and collaborators, but it also allows me to think through different questions and also methods by drawing in these different disciplines as well. And so I do want to say that if that is you thinking, oh no, I come from X discipline and now I'm here, I just want to say that your background isn't a liability. It adds richness to the conversation, to a field, a discipline, information science, that is so inherently collaborative and also interdisciplinary. So I think it adds to it. It doesn't take away, definitely.
Great, good answer. Thank you. We're running out of time, but we have a little short time here. And I'm curious about, as you talk about your makerspace, you're obviously very attuned to community, right? And trying to build community. Can you take maybe a minute to a minute and a half to tell us, how do you build community online in a Zoom session or in a Zoom class?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'll give my 1 minute spiel on this. So right now I'm also investigating something very interesting that's happening during remote learning. And that is our ability as a class to turn off the camera. That is our ability to manipulate what's being seen at a given time. And so I think in order to create community, we also need to understand how vulnerable it is to learn. In face-to-face, it's hard already, right? We're learning how to program in Arduino, but we feel like our instructor's watching us, our students aren't watching us, and also there's a self-assessment as well. And so what I'm finding and what I'm investigating through another research project is trying to get a sense of what does it mean to turn off the camera and learn within our own space where others aren't assessing us as well. So I think when thinking about community, it's super important to manipulate the features that we have, whether it's face-to-face or remote. And also another thing I found helpful was just arriving to this space as authentically as possible. We're arriving during a time where it's a pandemic, there's a lot of heaviness that we're holding together, and to be as flexible as possible. So that's my very short thing. But I will say, if you're interested, I just wrote an op-ed that's on Inside Higher Education about turning on and off the camera manipulation and its affordances for learning. So check that out if interested.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting, because all the conversation is about the isolation that happens with the Zoom interface, right? And the social isolation that's happening because of COVID. And here you're talking about turning off your camera and actually choosing to isolate yourself in order to build a sense of, I don't know, maybe personal space, right? And how we define personal space there. Well, thank you, Maggie. It's been great chatting with you. Thank you for joining us here. And
Thank you.
we're going to shift over to our final interviewee. So this is Matt Peralt. Thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here.
And welcome to SILS. Matt is just joining us, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you as part of our faculty here.
I'm excited as well.
Matt, can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you see it fitting in with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life that we have here at SILS?
Yeah, so I'm focused on technology policy and really try to be oriented around developing actionable policy frameworks that practitioners in the field can use. So I'm interested in industry practitioners. So how can tech companies improve their policies and enforcement procedures? I'm interested in government practitioners. So when government officials are trying to come up with what the rules should be to govern social media, govern tech companies, I'm interested in trying to be informative for them. So my goal is really to be oriented around trying to shape the kind of real world applications of tech policy rules. Your question about CTAP is a great one. So Katie Peters, the executive director of CTAP, came up with a really nice framing, I think, for the way that we interact. She calls what we're trying to do in technology policy a sibling center for CTAP. And I think that's really a very nice framing, assuming that you have a good relationship with your siblings. So I think the idea is really to have cross-pollination between our two worlds. So CTAP is doing unbelievable research and engagement across a range of different disciplines, from communications to journalism to law to sociology, and looking at tech issues and how tech affects our world in a really rich and deep way. And that is work that I think I'm just so thrilled to benefit from, and to have colleagues who are wrestling with such hard questions so deeply. And I think that I will really learn a tremendous amount from them, which I think will inform how we think about developing smart policy frameworks. You can't develop smart policy frameworks without a good idea of exactly how tech is operating for a range of different communities, and that's the work that CTAP is doing. So I'm hoping to learn from them, and then I'm also hoping that my industry experience and my understanding of the policy process will also hope to inform CTAP's work. And so thinking about concretely what's going on the policy side and how tech companies are thinking about what they do, I'm really hoping that will also be informative and helpful to how CTAP is doing what it's doing.
I think there's some delightful synergies there that will unfold over time as everything gets settled. All of our students are very interested in research and being involved in research and having opportunities to do research. Do you see those kinds of opportunities for students arising with the work that you do?
Yeah, so that's already happening. So one thing that I'm super excited about is a project that we have that I started last semester to track new Section 230 legislation. So Section 230 is a law that governs liability for tech platforms when they host speech of other people. And so basically the idea of Section 230 is that you can hold individuals liable for their speech, but not the platform that hosts that speech. And there are a whole bunch of bills pending in Congress now on that topic. There are a lot introduced in the last Congress, and then several that have been introduced in the current one. So we have a project where we're working with American University and Slate to track those pieces of legislation and to sort of have a comprehensive database of various different efforts to reform Section 230. There are now three UNC students who are working on that project and helping me out, two law students who are participating. And so that's an example of the kind of work that I'm hoping we'll be able to engage students with. It's a really cool project because students get their byline in Slate and are tracking this legislation that's pending in Congress, which is of interest to legislators, it's of interest to researchers, it's of interest to press. And so we're really hoping that this legislative tracker is kind of a hub for people who are trying to learn more about how policymakers are trying to change Section 230.
So as you think about bringing students on to your research and hiring, I'm sure that you've also hired a lot of other people that were not necessarily on research, but the students submitted a question prior that was relating to what kinds of information do you look for in an interview so that you can have a better sense of who they are.
Yeah, so I have two things I want to say in response to that. So the first one actually goes back to some of the questions that you were asking some of the previous faculty members about how they think about Zoom in the classroom. And I think all the suggestions are super interesting and creative and dynamic, which is, I hope how we will all approach online education. But one thing that has come to mind to me when there's been sort of a push, I think, from some people to make sure that we are physically in the classroom, and people who sort of talk negatively about the virtual experience, which I think I understand there are lots of downsides, lots of challenges. If you think when you leave your undergraduate or graduate experience and you go into a job in the quote unquote real world, that you will be able to pivot all virtual interactions to in-person interactions, and you will not need to learn via a screen or communicate via a screen, I think you're probably wrong. There may be some jobs where you can do that, but a lot of jobs, I think the jobs the SILS graduates will be pursuing require you to learn and communicate via a screen. So I think what better opportunity than the one that we have in front of us to have that be a part of your education. Clearly, I think there would be downsides if it was the sole component of your education, but I do think this is a moment to start developing and practicing the skills that will be important to future careers, and online communication, I think, is a really vital one. So I love online education, not because it's perfect, but because I think it serves a really important pedagogical function. One of the few gifts that we've gotten from the pandemic, which I know has not been full of gifts, but one of the few gifts that we've gotten, I think, in the academy is a real push to implement that more aggressively into our curricular offering. So it's thrilling to hear about how other faculty members are thinking about it. The second response to your question is that I think the kind of universal primary mistake that I see people make in an interview process is being focused on what you are doing as the interviewee, as opposed to what the interviewer needs. And so from an interview's perspective, at least in my job, every time I interviewed for a candidate, it's because I have an overwhelming amount of stuff to do, an unbelievable amount of things that I'm trying to get done. And I'm trying to grow a team so that we can get more of those things done. And that means I want my life to get easier. I want things that I need to do that I think are important to get done. I want to find people who can help us do those things, and ideally grow our to-do list even more and have more impact in the world. So by the time you reach an interview stage, I think you're usually at a point where someone has made a decision that things that you've done in the past qualifies you for that interview. And so you don't need to talk in detail about stuff that you did in the past. You need to convey to the person who's interviewing you, how are you going to make their life better? How are you going to make it easier? And so I think doing research around the needs of the person who is interviewing you and trying to make a pitch to them about why once that employer brings you on, their life is going to get so much better is really the crux of a good interview.
Yeah, it's a good point to focus on the needs rather than what you're bringing. Or at least what you're bringing, and then tie it to those needs.
Exactly. The fact you did a cool research project 2 years ago doesn't really matter, but if you can signal why doing that research project is going to really help your potential future employer, that's the kind of thing that I think is really helpful to hear.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, Matt, but thank you for joining us. It's been great having a conversation. I look forward to seeing you also in the hallways here at Manning Hall. And I'm hoping that all of you are willing to have students, if they're interested, drop you an email and start conversations. So with that, I will say thank you all for joining us at this Ask Me Anything session. And we look forward to seeing you at the remaining few that we have for the rest of the semester.